A soft morning light filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302 in downtown Atlanta's municipal court. Judge Michael Bennett adjusted his black robe as he settled into his high-backed leather chair, the familiar creak of wood beneath him serving as a reminder that another Monday morning was about to begin. At 45, Judge Bennett carried himself with the self-assuredness of someone who had spent the past 8 years presiding from this very bench. His salt and pepper hair and clean-shaven face gave him an air of distinction, though the shadows beneath his eyes hinted at the long hours he had been working lately. "Good morning, everyone," he said to the packed courtroom, his voice carrying the practiced blend of authority and detachment. The murmur of traffic violators, minor offenders, and their lawyers fell into silence. The morning sunlight caught the Golden State seal mounted on the wall behind him, casting a warm glow across the room. Sarah Martinez, his court clerk of 5 years, handed him the day's docket. 37 cases today, Your Honor," she said, placing a fresh cup of black coffee, his third of the morning, beside the papers. Judge Bennett nodded, already scanning the first page of infractions: speeding tickets, running red lights, illegal parking, the usual Monday morning parade of minor offenses. The courtroom mirrored Bennett's personality: orderly, traditional, and meticulously maintained. The dark wood panels gleamed from recent polishing, and even the American flag in the corner appeared freshly pressed. He ran his courtroom like a well-oiled machine, earning both respect and apprehension from the local legal community. Officer James Patterson, a familiar face in Bennett's courtroom, stood near the bailiff's desk, reviewing his notes for the day's cases. He caught the judge's eye and gave a respectful nod. Bennett returned the gesture, remembering how last week he had upheld every one of Patterson's traffic violations. The officer had a reputation for thorough paperwork, a quality Bennett valued highly. As the bailiff called the court to order, Bennett took a moment to straighten his nameplate, Honorable Michael J. Bennett, making sure it faced the perfect angle toward the gallery. It was these small details that, in his mind, set the tone for justice. His reputation for being strict but fair hadn't been accidental. It had been built on countless small decisions and an unwavering commitment to the law. Looking out at the crowd, Bennett noticed the usual mix of faces: nervous first-time offenders in their Sunday best, repeat visitors who knew the drill, and lawyers in varying degrees of expensive suits. What none of them knew was that Bennett had spent his weekend poring over legal journals and reviewing recent appellate court decisions. He prided himself on staying current with the law, just as he had during his days at Emory Law School. The first case was about to begin when Bennett felt a strange sensation, almost like a premonition. Something about today felt different, though he couldn't quite pinpoint it. In his 8 years on the bench, he had learned to trust these instincts, which had served him well before. "First case," Sarah announced, her voice clear and professional. The familiar routine began, but Bennett couldn't shake the feeling that this Monday wouldn't be just like any other. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the dust particles in the air like tiny stars. Bennett took another sip of his coffee, its bitterness grounding him in the present moment. He had earned his position through hard work and dedication, rising from a middle-class background in suburban Atlanta to his current role in one of the city's busiest courts. His colleagues often joked that he could process a traffic violation in his sleep, and some days, it felt that way. Each case followed the same pattern: hear the violation, review the evidence, listen to the defense, make a ruling. He had it down to a science, averaging just 12 minutes per case. Efficiency and fairness were the pillars of his courtroom. As the first defendant approached the podium, Bennett straightened his posture and cleared his throat. Whatever the day might bring, he would face it as he did every day, with unwavering dedication to the law and the firm belief that justice should be blind to everything but the facts before him. Little did Judge Michael Bennett know that this ordinary Monday would soon become one of the most extraordinary days of his career, challenging everything he thought he knew about justice, bias, and the power of unexpected reunions. Dr. Regina Washington stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully pinning her silver-streaked locks away from her face. At 63, she carried herself with the same grace and determination that had made her one of Emory Law School's most respected professors over the past 3 decades. The speeding ticket lay on her dresser, its bright yellow color seeming to mock her from across the room. 2 weeks ago, on her way to deliver a guest lecture at Clark Atlanta University, Officer Robert Mills had pulled her over in what she knew was a notorious speed trap on Ponce de Leon Avenue. 72 in a 55, he had claimed, even though Regina's cruise control had been set precisely at the speed limit. She had noticed how his body camera had mysteriously been turned off during their interaction and how his hand had rested unnecessarily on his holster throughout the exchange. As she slipped into her charcoal gray suit, the one she wore for important court arguments, Regina thought about the 3 other black professors who had been pulled over at the same spot over the past month. None of their tickets had stuck in court, but that wasn't the point. The pattern was too evident to ignore. Her colleague, Dr. James Thompson, had urged her to just pay the fine. "Regina, it's not worth the hassle," he'd said during lunch. "These things have a way of getting messy." But Regina Washington hadn't spent 30 years teaching constitutional law to back down from injustice, no matter how small. She gathered her materials, a folder containing photographs of the speed trap location, data on traffic stops in the area showing racial disparities, and her spotless driving record spanning 4 decades. Her hands smoothed over the papers, each document representing hours of meticulous preparation. The morning traffic crawled along Peachtree Street as Regina made her way downtown. Her silver Toyota Avalon, the supposed vehicle of her offense, moved steadily through the lanes. The heat radiated from the pavement as the car's radio played softly. Nina Simone's "I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free." A fitting soundtrack for the morning ahead. As she pulled into the courthouse parking lot, Regina noticed Officer Mills entering the building. He walked with the confident stride of someone who assumed his word would never be questioned. She watched him for a moment, recalling how different his tone had been when he first approached her car before seeing her university ID and professional attire. The courthouse security guard, an older black man named Walter, greeted her with a knowing smile as he ran her bag through the scanner. "Fighting a ticket today, Dr. Washington?" he asked. Regina had represented his grandson, Prano, last year in a similar situation. "Someone has to, Mr. Johnson," she replied, her voice carrying the warm authority that had guided countless Emory students through complex constitutional arguments. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor gave Regina time to center herself. She had stood before the Supreme Court of Georgia, argued cases that had changed state law, and shaped the minds of future legal giants. A simple traffic court appearance shouldn't make her nervous, yet her heart beat a little faster as the doors opened. Courtroom 302 was already filling up when she entered. Regina chose a seat in the middle row, her posture perfect and her expression serene. Around her, other traffic violators fidgeted and whispered, many worried about missing work or school. She noticed she was one of only 3 black people in the room who weren't wearing security or maintenance uniforms. Officer Mills sat near the front, shuffling through his papers. He glanced back once, his eyes widening slightly when he recognized her. Regina met his gaze steadily, her expression unchanged. In her briefcase was a file containing his department records, 3 previous complaints of racial profiling, all mysteriously dismissed. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9 a.m. Regina reviewed her notes one last time, though she knew every detail by heart. This wasn't just about a $300 speeding ticket anymore. It was about patterns, prejudices, and the subtle ways injustice crept into everyday life. A young law student in turn entered the courtroom carrying a stack of files. He stopped short when he saw Regina, clearly recognizing her from her faculty headshot at Emory. She gave him a small nod, remembering how many times she had told her students that the most important cases often started with the smallest injustices. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "All rise." As everyone stood, Regina took a deep breath. 30 years of teaching law had taught her that justice sometimes needed a reminder of its obligations. Today, she was prepared to deliver that reminder, not knowing that the biggest surprise of the morning was yet to come. The morning proceeded slowly in courtroom 302, with Judge Bennett moving through cases at his usual efficient pace. When the bailiff finally called, Regina Washington versus State of Georgia, Officer Mills straightened his uniform and Regina gathered her materials with steady hands as she approached the podium. Regina noticed how Judge Bennett barely glanced up from his papers. His fingers drummed impatiently on the bench as Officer Mills presented his case first, a routine recitation of speed, time, and location. Your Honor, the officer spoke with practiced confidence. On April 15th, at approximately 2:45 p.m., I observed Dr. Washington's vehicle traveling at 72 miles per hour in a 55 zone. He paused and then added, the radar gun was recently calibrated, and weather conditions were clear. Judge Bennett nodded, accepting the officer's statement without question. When he finally looked up at Regina, his expression carried the bored, slightly irritated look of someone who had heard every possible excuse for speeding. Dr. Washington, do you have anything to add? His tone suggested he hoped she didn't. Regina opened her folder with deliberate calm. Yes, Your Honor, I have several points I would like to present regarding this citation. She began pulling out her carefully prepared documents. Bennett raised his hand to stop her. Dr. Washington, this is traffic court. We don't need a full presentation. Did you, or did you not exceed the speed limit? His words were sharp and dismissive. Regina wanted to point out the logical fallacy in his question, that it presumed guilt and ignored context, but she tried again. Your Honor, I believe it's important to consider the broader context of this citation. I have evidence. Dr. Washington, he interrupted, impatience now visible. This court has 23 more cases to hear today. Unless you have direct evidence disputing the radar reading, I suggest we move forward. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had ceased. Regina stood straight, her dignity intact despite the judge's dismissive tone. I do have evidence, Your Honor, she persisted, her voice clear and steady. First, there are documented issues with traffic stops at this specific location. Bennett waved it away. That's not relevant to your specific violation, Dr. Washington. Frustration stirred in Regina's chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when facing systemic barriers. But decades of teaching had taught her to channel that frustration into precise, measured responses. Your Honor, if you would allow me to present my full defense. Bennett cut her off again, his voice final. This court appreciates thoroughness. We're not here to discuss broader social issues. This is a simple matter of whether you were speeding on the day in question. Officer Mills stood a little straighter, a small smile at the corners of his mouth. Regina noticed how comfortable he looked, how certain he was of the outcome. She had seen that same confidence in countless other situations where authority went unquestioned. Your Honor, Regina tried one last time. My cruise control was set exactly at the speed limit. I have documentation showing. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. That's enough, Dr. Washington. This court has heard sufficient testimony. He began writing on his citation pad, barely looking up as he spoke. The courtroom was abuzz with frantic note-taking, the judge's expression a mixture of confusion and concern. It was only last week that Rena had covered procedural due process in her constitutional law class. Standing perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the podium, she had anticipated resistance, but the complete dismissal of her evidence surprised even her seasoned eyes. The air in the courtroom felt tense, charged with unspoken tension. Judge Bennett, finishing his notes, looked up, his face suggesting that this was just another routine matter in his busy schedule. Given Officer Mills' clear evidence and the absence of compelling evidence to the contrary, this court finds. At that moment, Rena knew it was time to reveal her full identity and credentials. She had hoped her evidence alone would be enough, but now realized that a shift in approach was necessary. As she prepared to speak, she understood that this case was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would shake Judge Bennett's sense of order. Just as Judge Bennett was about to pronounce the fine, Dr. Washington straightened her posture and spoke in the authoritative, commanding voice that had captivated law students for 3 decades. Your Honor, before you make your ruling, I believe it's important to identify myself for the record. She paused, locking eyes with Bennett. I am Dr. Regina Washington, tenured professor of constitutional law at Emory University School of Law, where I have taught for the past 30 years. Judge Bennett's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His pen stopped mid-sentence, hovering over the citation pad as recognition flickered across his face, followed by a wave of color draining from his cheeks. I also serve as the director of the Civil Rights Legal Clinic, she continued, her voice steady and controlled. And more relevantly to this court, I taught advanced constitutional law to the 2009 graduating class, where you, Judge Bennett, earned one of the highest grades in my seminar on equal protection under the law. The courtroom fell silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers ceased. Officer Mills glanced between the judge and Dr. Washington, his smugness replaced by uncertainty. Bennett sat frozen, memories flooding back with unstoppable force. He remembered sitting in the front row of her class, scribbling notes furiously as she passionately spoke on procedural fairness. He remembered her strict but encouraging feedback on his papers, her unwavering dedication to justice, and most of all, her constant reminder that true justice required hearing all sides of a story. Dr. Washington, Bennett finally managed, his voice barely audible. Professor Washington, he said, and the formality felt foreign, considering how often he had called her professor or ma'am during his law school days. Sarah Martinez, the court clerk, watched with a mix of astonishment and concern as Bennett's hands trembled slightly as he set down his pen. In 8 years, she had never seen him lose composure. Dr. Washington remained standing, calm and dignified, as though this were just another teachable moment. Yes, Your Honor, I believe you wrote your final paper on the importance of procedural due process and minor violations and its impact on community trust in the legal system. It was quite impressive. The irony of the situation weighed heavily on everyone. Several attorneys exchanged knowing looks while a law student intern at the back of the room typed furiously, likely sharing the moment with his peers. Judge Bennett glanced down at the incomplete citation in front of him, then at the stack of evidence Dr. Washington had tried to present earlier. He remembered his own words from that paper. Justice is not merely about the outcome, but about the process through which we arrive at that outcome. The realization was a weight pressing down on him, a stark reminder that he had just acted in precisely the manner he had once critiqued in his law school papers. Officer Mills shifted uncomfortably at the podium, the confident authority he had shown earlier now deflating with every passing second. Bennett started to speak but hesitated, for the first time in his career at a loss for words in his own courtroom. The weight of the moment, the recognition that he had demonstrated the exact type of rushed judgment he had once denounced, made it hard to breathe. The silence stretched, feeling like minutes but only seconds in reality. The usual crowd of traffic violators sat, no longer bored or restless, but captivated by the unfolding drama. Finally, Bennett cleared his throat, and the sound broke the silence like a gunshot. "This court," he began, his voice steadier than he felt, "will take a 15-minute recess." He reached for his gavel but paused, then added, "And when we return, Dr. Washington, I would very much like to hear your evidence in full." In his chambers, Bennett sat alone, his hands pressed against his temples as memories of his law school days at Emory flooded back with vivid clarity. The massive wooden door couldn't block out the excited whispers from a hallway as news spread through the courthouse. He could picture Dr. Washington's classroom, room 308, where the afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. Her voice, firm but encouraging, echoed in his mind. "The law is living, breathing. It's not just words on paper, Mr. Bennett. It's about human dignity." His eyes fell on a framed photo on his desk, his graduation day. There she was, standing proudly beside him, her hand on his shoulder. She had once said he was one of her favorite students because he always questioned, always looked deeper, never allowed efficiency to override justice. Her words in his yearbook came back to him. "Never forget that true justice requires questioning your assumptions." A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Sarah," he said, as his clerk poked her head inside. "Your Honor, I pulled up your law review article from 2009, the one you wrote for Professor Washington's class." She placed the printed pages on his desk and withdrew quietly. Bennett's hands shook as he picked up the paper. The title jumped out at him, Implicit Bias in Traffic Court, a study of procedural justice in minor violations. His own words condemned him. The rushed nature of traffic court proceedings often leads to unconscious biases affecting judicial decision-making. Down the hall, in the ladies' room, Dr. Washington stood before the mirror, adjusting her collar. She wasn't thinking of the ticket anymore, but was instead reminiscing about a young Michael Bennett, always sitting in the front row with thoughtful questions. She recalled his passion for fair procedures, his earnest belief in justice for all. The young law student in turn found her in the hallway, excitement clear on his face. "Dr. Washington," he whispered, "we just covered your case study on implicit bias last week. This is incredible." She gave him a gentle smile, knowing this would indeed become another case study, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Officer Mills sat alone on a bench outside the courtroom, reviewing his notes with growing unease as other officers passed by, giving him questioning looks. Back in his chambers, Bennett reached for the notebooks he had kept from law school, stored in the bottom drawer for years. There it was, Dr. Washington's final lecture on judicial responsibility. Your deadliest enemy on the bench won't be corruption or incompetence. It will be complacency. It will be the assumption that you're too good, too fair to be biased. His own margin notes stared back at him. Justice must be both efficient and thorough. Never sacrifice one for the other. When had he forgotten that? When had his pride in processing cases quickly overcome his commitment to hearing every voice? The courthouse clock ticked steadily toward the end of the recess. Regular citizens, waiting for their minor violations to be addressed, forgot their own troubles as the drama unfolded. Sarah returned with coffee and set it carefully on his desk. 3 minutes, Your Honor, she said, hesitating before adding, "The press is here." Someone tipped them off. Bennett nodded, barely hearing her as he was lost in memory. Dr. Washington's words from his judicial inauguration echoed in his mind. "Remember, Michael, every case is someone's most important day in court. Even if it's your 1,000th speeding ticket, it's their first time facing justice." He stood up, straightening his robe. It felt different now, heavier with responsibility. Through the window, he watched Dr. Washington re-enter the courthouse, her dignified bearing unchanged. She had taught him well, but somewhere along the way, the daily grind had dulled his principles. 2 minutes until court resumes. A bailiff's voice called from the hallway. Bennett gathered his thoughts and his courage. He had a choice to make, not just about a speeding ticket, but about the kind of judge he wanted to be, the kind of judge Dr. Washington had trained him to be. As he reached for the door to the courtroom, his eyes fell one last time on the conclusion of his law school article. True justice requires courage, the courage to slow down, to listen, to question our own assumptions. It was time to put those words into action. When Judge Bennett turned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. The usual drowsy Monday morning air was now electric with anticipation. Every seat was filled, with observers standing along the back wall. Word had spread quickly through the courthouse about the unexpected reunion of judge and professor. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice carrying more weight than usual. As Bennett took his seat, he noticed senior judges had slipped into the back of the courtroom, curious to see what would happen next. "Please be seated," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. He looked directly at Dr. Washington, who stood calmly at the podium. "Dr. Washington, before we proceed, I owe this court, and you particularly, an apology." A murmur rippled through the gallery. In 8 years, no one had ever heard Judge Bennett apologize. Officer Mills shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the citation book forgotten in his lap. "This court," Bennett continued, his words careful and deliberate, "prides itself on fairness and due process. However, today I failed to uphold those standards. I allowed the pressure of a busy docket to override the fundamental right of a defendant to present their full case." Dr. Washington's expression remained neutral, though those who knew her well might have noticed the slight softening around her eyes. She had seen countless students reach moments of profound understanding during her 30 years of teaching. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice as gentle and authoritative as it had been in class, "perhaps we could review the evidence I attempted to present earlier." Bennett nodded, signaling Sarah to approach the bench. "Yes, Professor, please present your full case." This court is prepared to give it the attention it deserves. He remembered how she used to say justice wasn't a race to be won, but a path to be walked carefully. For the next 45 minutes, Dr. Washington presented her evidence meticulously. She showed photographs of the speed trap location, explained how the position of the sun at that time could affect radar readings, and presented statistical data revealing troubling patterns in traffic stops at that location. The young law student intern at the back furiously took notes as his former professor turned a simple traffic hearing into a masterclass on constitutional law and civil rights. Several attorneys in the gallery recorded her presentation on their phones for future reference. Officer Mills' confidence seemed to shrink with each new piece of evidence. When Dr. Washington presented the maintenance records for her car, showing that the cruise control had been recently calibrated, he studied his shoes intently. Bennett listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions that revealed he was now fully engaged with the complexity of the case. It was as though the eager law student he once was had emerged from beneath the efficient but sometimes dismissive judge he had become. Furthermore, Your Honor, Dr. Washington concluded, I believe this case reflects a larger issue with procedural justice in our traffic courts. When we rush through these so-called minor cases, we risk overlooking major injustices. The irony in her words was not lost on anyone present. Bennett's thoughts drifted to his own law review article, now sitting on his bench, its pages marked with newfound significance. Thank you, Dr. Washington, Bennett said. As she finished, he removed his reading glasses and surveyed the packed courtroom. This court is going to take an unusual step. I will not only review this case in detail, but will also order a broader review of traffic stop patterns in this jurisdiction. Sarah, who had been his clerk for 5 years, had never seen him like this. It was as if she was witnessing a transformation in real time. The efficient, sometimes mechanical judge was being replaced by someone more thoughtful and thorough. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. for my ruling, Bennett announced, and Dr. Washington looked up at her former student, now appearing more like the young man she had taught than the rushed judge of an hour ago. Thank you for reminding this court of its fundamental obligations. As the bailiff called out, all rise, the wait in courtroom 302 felt profound. Everyone present understood they had witnessed something significant, not just the possibility of justice served, but justice redefined. Dr. Washington gathered her materials quietly, a small smile playing at her lips. Some lessons, she knew, took years to take hold, but when they did, they had the power to change not just one case, but an entire system. The next morning, courtroom 302 was filled beyond capacity. Judge Bennett had spent the entire night reviewing evidence, statistics, and his past rulings. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night, but his voice was clear and strong as he began to deliver his ruling. The court has thoroughly reviewed the evidence presented in the case of Dr. Regina Washington, he began, looking out at the unusually crowded room. Local media were gathered in the back, their presence adding weight to the day's proceedings. What began as a simple traffic violation had unveiled issues demanding this court's full attention. Sarah noted how different her boss looked today. Gone was the rushed efficiency that had marked his previous hearings. Now, he sat with the thoughtful demeanor of a man who had rediscovered his purpose. First, regarding the specific citation, he continued, flipping through his carefully prepared notes, this court finds significant issues with the evidence presented by the citing officer. Officer Mills, seated in the front row, seemed to shrink in his chair. Dr. Washington's evidence regarding the speed trap location, supported by statistical data and technical analysis, raised serious concerns. The court had verified that the sun's position at the time of the citation could indeed have affected radar readings, as the defense suggested. The judge then lifted a thick folder. More troublingly, this court has reviewed traffic stop data from the past 6 months at this location. He paused, his expression grave. The patterns revealed in this data are deeply concerning. Dr. Washington sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching her former student demonstrate the thorough analysis she had always encouraged in class. The citation against Dr. Washington is hereby dismissed, Bennett announced. But instead of moving to the next case, he continued, however, This court cannot ignore the broader issues this case has highlighted. He pulled out a second document. I am ordering an immediate review of all traffic citations issued at this location over the past year. Additionally, I am recommending an independent investigation into potential racial disparities in traffic enforcement patterns within our jurisdiction. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and several civil rights attorneys in the gallery began taking rapid notes. Officer Mills stood abruptly and left the room, his face flushed. Furthermore, Bennett's voice cut through the murmurs. This court is implementing new procedures for traffic violation hearings. He looked directly at Dr. Washington. Every defendant will be given adequate time to present their full case. Efficiency is important, but not at the expense of justice. The young law student intern who had witnessed the prior day's events was now sitting with classmates who had skipped morning classes to attend. They watched their professor's calm expression, understanding now why she had always insisted that real change could happen in small courtrooms as much as in Supreme Courts. Finally, Bennett said, this court is establishing a review committee to examine our procedures for potential bias. We will be requesting assistance from legal scholars and civil rights experts. He paused, allowing himself a small smile. And we hope that Dr. Washington might consider lending her expertise to this endeavor. Sarah noticed tears in the eyes of an elderly black woman in the gallery. Later, she would learn that the woman had lost her job last year after missing work to contest a ticket at this same location, a ticket that had been rushed through without a proper hearing. This case has reminded us, Bennett concluded, his voice heavy with personal realization, that justice is not a convenience. It is a right and must be protected with vigilance, no matter how minor a case may seem. As he finished speaking, the courtroom remained silent for a moment before erupting into quiet conversations. Reporters rushed out to file their stories while legal observers discussed the broader implications of the ruling. Dr. Washington allowed herself a full smile as she gathered her things, watching as various attorneys and activists approached the bench for copies of the ruling. This was why she had chosen to contest a simple traffic ticket, not just to defend herself, but to expose systemic issues affecting countless others. As she prepared to leave, she noticed Judge Bennett watching her from the bench. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, teacher and student shared an understanding. Sometimes, the most important lessons took years to manifest. When they did, they had the power to create ripples of change that went far beyond a single courtroom. The impact of that morning's ruling would soon extend far beyond courtroom 302, but for now, justice had been served, not just for one professor, but for an entire community that had long awaited recognition. 6 months after the landmark traffic court ruling, Judge Michael Bennett stood at the podium in Emory Law School's main auditorium. The room was filled with judges, lawyers, law enforcement officers, and students, all gathered for the first session of the newly established Judicial Bias Training Program. When I dismissed a simple traffic ticket 6 months ago, Bennett began, his voice carrying across the silent room, I didn't realize it would lead to the most significant changes in our court's history. He paused, looking at the familiar face in the front row, Dr. Washington, who sat with the same dignified presence she had maintained throughout her career. The statistics displayed on the screen behind him told a compelling story. Since implementing the new procedures, successful traffic ticket appeals had increased by 40%. More importantly, the racial disparity in traffic stop outcomes had decreased significantly. The infamous speed trap location had been thoroughly investigated, leading to the retirement of 2 officers and the implementation of new monitoring systems. Today marks the beginning of something important, Bennett continued. Not just a training program, but a commitment to recognize and address our own biases. He gestured toward Dr. Washington. And there's no one better qualified to lead us on this journey than my former professor, who taught me this lesson in the most unexpected way. Dr. Washington took the podium to enthusiastic applause. The past months had been busy as she helped design the training program while continuing her teaching duties and serving on the court's new review committee. Her traffic court experience had become a case study now taught in law schools across the country. Justice, she began, her voice strong and clear, is not about being perfect. It's about being willing to recognize our imperfections and address them. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of young officers and veteran judges alike. What happened in courtroom 302 that day wasn't just about a traffic ticket. It was about the courage to change. The program they unveiled that day was comprehensive. It included regular reviews of court decisions for potential bias, mandatory waiting periods before rulings in certain cases, and a new system for defendants to submit complete evidence packages before their hearings. In the audience, Officer Mills, now required to attend as part of his continued employment, sat quietly taking notes. Experience had changed him too, making him more thoughtful in his traffic stops and more careful with his documentation. Sarah Martinez, who had been promoted to chief court administrator, shared the practical results of their changes. Average case processing time had increased by 12 minutes, but appeal rates had dropped dramatically. More importantly, community trust in the court system had shown measurable improvement. The young law student who had witnessed the original case, now a newly minted intern at the public defender's office, raised his hand during the Q&A session. "How do we maintain this momentum?" he asked. "How do we ensure these changes last?" Dr. Washington smiled at the question. "By remembering that every case matters," she answered. "By understanding that justice isn't just about the law. It's about the people the law serves." Judge Bennett nodded in agreement. He thought about how different his courtroom felt now. The rushed atmosphere had been replaced by something more deliberate, more thorough. Yes, they handled fewer cases per day, but they handled them right. As the session concluded, Bennett and Dr. Washington stood together for photographs. Local newspapers had dubbed their story "The Lesson That Changed the Court," and it had inspired similar reviews in jurisdictions across the country. "You know," Bennett said quietly to his former professor as the cameras flashed, "the traffic ticket was the most expensive lesson I've ever learned and the most valuable." Dr. Washington laughed softly. "The best lessons often come when we least expect them, Michael," she said. "And sometimes the student becomes the teacher." The afternoon sun streamed through the auditorium windows, reminiscent of those long-ago days in her classroom. But now, instead of just teaching theory, they were putting principles into practice, creating real change in real courtrooms. As attendees filed out, many stopped to share their own stories of bias they had witnessed or unconsciously perpetuated. Each story reinforced the importance of their work and the need for continuous vigilance and improvement. The traffic ticket that had brought them to this point now hung framed in Bennett's chambers, a reminder that justice could be found in the smallest of cases and that change could begin with a single moment of recognition. Outside, the Atlanta traffic flowed as usual, but inside the courthouse, something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just about traffic tickets anymore. It was about building a justice system that truly lived up to its name, one case at a time.